People will get angry with the processor a lot of times.
Sure.
And it depends on the processor. Some are very unforgiving when it comes to chargebacks. Us as a specialized processor, if we see something occurring, we're going to work with you, put a plan in place to help mitigate it, and try to understand the root cause of why it's occurring in the first place.
Okay, it's good to see you, Drew. I'm here with Drew Brasiel, account executive here at TouchSuite. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, glad to be back.
Why don't you tell us a little bit, just a quick refresher on your background since you've done this before, but just so people that might be new kind of know who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I got into the payments world, I actually studied health sciences, was pretty involved in that space, worked as a personal trainer for a little while, and then ended up getting my MBA and worked in consumer mortgage for a little bit. Really enjoyed it, building the relationships, but I wanted to get into something to where I was solving a little bit more complex problems. So that's how I kind of got into the payment space, came over here in TouchSuite, and been able to tie that health experience into my targeted vertical here at TouchSuite, which is Nutraceuticals. So a lot of those clients struggle with the topic that we're going to discuss today, which would be chargebacks, and then they have other pain points just associated with payments, which they need a high-risk provider like myself and like TouchSuite to solve for a lot of the challenges they face.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's start off the discussion with what you just brought up, which is chargebacks and the growing significance in the digital payment landscape specifically.
Yeah, so I think as digital commerce progresses, we're seeing more and more people buying online. I think COVID was a major accelerant of that preference can in comparison to like traditional retail channel sales, and with that grows increased chargebacks. Now, chargebacks can result from a multitude of reasons. Some of them are very simple, some of them can be very complex, but as people go onto websites and purchase their products more often, and companies grow and scale, and they have a higher number of transactions, chargebacks is just one of the growing pains that comes along with that growth, is what we see on our end.
It's par for the course.
Exactly.
Got you. So as a leading expert in payment processing, as we've discussed, what are some of the key challenges that merchants face when dealing with chargebacks? What's the hardest thing for them to kind of handle with that?
Yeah, the biggest thing is in general, they tend to, the card brands always tend to side with the customer, right? So it's always, you're always at a disadvantage because it's likely going to go in favor of the issuing institution. Now, the way that you can kind of get around that is by having really good customer service and trying to, work with your merchants or with your customers, if they have some type of issue with the product. You want to make sure that you're providing them with the top level of customer service. And there's going to be a lot of like high-tech solutions out there, and there are some really good platforms that help with chargebacks. But for today's sake, I want to focus on really easy to implement tools that just your standard business owner could tweak today and maybe implement, rather than going out and looking into acquiring some high-tech software that can kind of screen for the potential of e-commerce fraud and things like that.
Something a little more user-friendly.
Exactly.
Perfect. So what are some of those best practices that merchants can implement to effectively resolve the chargebacks and kind of reduce the overall impact of them?
Yeah, so like I said, the biggest one is just customer communication.
Right.
If at any point in the process a customer reaches out to a service department, has an issue with a product, if nobody responds to them and they don't feel like there's a course of refund or reconciliation or sending another product out, a lot of times people are very quick to charge that back. Now, you'll also see that sometimes people just have buyer's remorse. Now, even if you have a very firm no refund policy in place, it's always better to just take the hit on issuing that refund, because you don't have any challenges with the payment processor if you have too many refunds. That's something that people often think when they talk to me, is that, oh, well, we had a bunch of refunds last month, like, is that going to count against us? It's a misconception. It's when it becomes a chargeback, when the customer thinks that you're not taking care of them or refunding them when they are owed that refund, is when you get in an issue with the chargeback. So the servicing piece is one of the biggest things that you can do, and with that becomes the way that you would actually communicate with a customer when they purchase something. So every time you and I buy something, we get some type of email that comes from us. Hey, here's your order. It's expected at this time. So I always favor on the side of having too many updates on the order status, because if you're a regular direct-to-consumer e-commerce website, you likely have a longer fulfillment timeline than like an Amazon. And that's what people come to expect is next day shipping.
Sure.
And we live in this world of instant gratification, right?
Absolutely.
So if people don't get those updates, and especially if it's a higher ticket purchase where maybe they were a little apprehensive buying in the first place, if you're not on top of them with updates and customer service, if they have any questions in that timeline that you're fulfilling, it very quickly can progress into a chargeback, which is when it becomes grief with your processing company or you as the business owner, especially after you've already fulfilled. The last thing you want to do is have them issue a chargeback, get the product, and then you be out that money in the meantime. So it's honestly better to just come to a good reconciliation with the customer.
Gotcha.
And even if you're going to take a hit on a refund here or there, you got to see it from the bigger picture rather than the short-term financial aspect of it.
Well, and you keep the customers happy, and even if they're not happy with what they just got, they're going to come back in the future. And if they have a bad experience with you, they're sure not going to do that later on.
Exactly. I mean, I read reviews all the time where a customer didn't even end up like using a product, they returned it, and if they had a good experience with that process, they can still go on and talk about, hey, this didn't work out for me, it wasn't the best product, but customer service is great. Like, you can still get good press out of those things.
Sure.
And not have any complexities with, jeopardizing the stability of your processing account, because people will get angry with the processor a lot of times.
Sure.
And it depends on the processor. Some are very unforgiving when it comes to chargebacks. Us as a specialized processor, if we see something occurring, we're going to work with you, put a plan in place to help mitigate it and try to understand the root cause of why it's occurring in the first place. So that's the biggest difference of working with us and having a direct account manager versus, working with one of the other payment aggregators that may be in the space.
Gotcha.
But yeah, that's the biggest thing is just making sure that you see the bigger picture. And a lot of times it's not up to the processor. Like I said, it's when the card brands get involved and they come to us and they say, hey, this person's on our radar, you need to put a mitigation plan in place. So it's the processor never wants to take drastic action. It's just when the card brands get on their radar, how is that processor going to respond to it? And the good ones will work with you, not just shut the account down because they don't want the liability of it.
Sure, of course. So moving on to something else, considering the growing sophistication of fraudsters in the market, how can businesses stay ahead of the curve and protect themselves from fraudulent chargebacks?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, right?
Yeah.
It's the fraud. I mean, we see a high prevalence of fraud in our industry. People that come in and they have all their ducks in a row. They have ownership information. They try to open accounts. And luckily, myself on the front lines, the rest of the sales team, and our internal risk and underwriting team, I mean, we catch people all the time, right? But the same goes for fraudulent transactions, stolen card data. So there's always going to be somewhat of a prevalence of that, and it definitely is growing, unfortunately. But the biggest thing is working with your processor to evaluate any type of suspicious transactions. I have clients ask me all the time. They'll maybe get an alert from their gateway that it's a higher risk transaction, and they'll just call me and they'll say, hey, what do you feel about this? There were a couple things that seemed a little suspicious. Should I fulfill this? Should I process it? And it's having that direct relationship. And then if it's something that I don't feel comfortable directly speaking on, I go to our risk and underwriting team and they do further R&D before fulfilling, and then having a customer that may have gotten their card stolen, the fraudster gets that purchase, and then you get a chargeback anyway, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So that's more on the low-tech side. And then there's a ton of tools out there that you can implement on the front lines that would actually do real-time fraud detection. And in your standard gateway, you can tweak how you want those transactions to go through, whether you want to be a little more stringent on the fraud, which I always recommend is I would rather have a higher decline ratio because my gateway is turning down fraudulent transactions than opening up the floodgates to everything, getting a higher approval percentage on transactions, but then dealing with the fallout of the chargebacks, the fraud, and things like that. And it's very dependent upon the business model, the prevalence of it as well. So we kind of have a good eye for which type of business transactions and industry types have a higher prevalence of it. So we keep a sharper eye on those accounts.
Gotcha. And you brought up something which has come up in previous podcasts with some of the other people around here, which is the risk assessment team that you have. It's got to be super helpful to have them in-house with you guys right here. If you have any questions or any issues, I mean, it's literally a few feet away for you to go walk over and find out what's going on.
100%. It's a great point to bring that up. I mean, it's a big value add for us having everything internally. Myself being on the internal sales team, not an outside agent, which there are some outside agents out there that we work with that do a fantastic job. I'm not diminishing them, but like you said, if something needs done or we have a transaction that we're suspicious about, if it's legitimate, you want to fulfill it. You want to get that order out the door. You want to make the revenue on it. But you don't want to have to wait 2-3 business days for a response on,
Right.
hey, is this a good idea? So when somebody calls me about those things, I understand they have money on the line.